Welcome to Goldfish on Games. Flashback is a game that holds a lot of fond memories for gamers of the 90s, and for good reason. It was an amazing game. It sold over 2 million copies and managed to hit over 12 platforms, with the Switch version, which just came out, being the most recent. Now, with a game that sold that well and is that fondly remembered by critics and fans, you would have thought a sequel would have been a no-brainer. But it took 3 years before we saw anything, and it only arrived on a single platform on launch, and really only got one port after that. That game is the mostly forgotten Fade to Black. This is the original DOS release that came in the standard EA slipcase for the PC, and inside we can find the disc, a manual which is very much needed, and the installation guide, which is less. And on the subject of installers, the setup program for this game was actually done in 3D and was quite spectacular for the time, and I included it in my installation video because it was that unique. Now, with the installer being in 3D, it's unsurprisingly that the game itself was full 3D and used a third-person camera, and might be one of the earliest examples of a third-person shooter, possibly even the first. And it managed to release a good year or two before Tomb Raider, so it really was at the beginning of this style of game. But unfortunately, Tomb Raider was able to put that extra time and experience from other games to good use, and had very good controls for its time, and for the most part today still, where Fade to Black has some real issues with its controls. It's possibly the biggest problem with this game. The game is a direct sequel to Flashback and picks up immediately from the ending of the first game. Now, spoiler alert, if you've not played Flashback or not seen any videos with the ending, you may want to look away now or check one of those out. And so, after you blew up the Morph's homeworld at the end of the first game, you were left drifting in space in your spaceship. And this is where the Morphs find you. And in typical bad guy style, instead of killing you, they pick you up and put you in a prison with a very human name, New Alcatraz. Now obviously you're not there very long before you escape, helped by Mandragore, an underground resistance movement that are trying to fight the Morphs. And with that, you are now set in a brand new game in a brand new dimension. The game at the time actually looked really amazing. We had texture maps on the walls, we had all sorts of funky lighting effects, we had shading on all the models. It really did look really amazing, but it was capped at quite a low frame rate. You could disable this frame rate cap, but some of the movement then ended up feeling a bit weird. The movement always felt weird anyway, so it's a bit of a trade-off whether or not you want the faster frame rate, or if you wanted the controls that felt a little bit better. But as been hinted at already, it didn't matter what the frame rate was, the control system was not great. And what do I mean by this? There were quite a few options for how you controlled the game. All of them were not fun to use. The standard keyboard layout looks like this. Now that isn't even the best option for the keyboard. What I found is much easier to use is the Numpad Configuration, which looks like this. Yep, it's pretty much using every single key on the numpad and some extras. You could also control the game with the mouse, with some really weird but interesting ideas for controls, and you could also use a joystick, but again you still needed to use the keyboard for some of the actions because under DOS most joysticks were limited to either simple flight sticks or joypads with a very limited number of buttons. And don't think that you could just easily rebind the controls to suit your playstyle, because being a game of this age, all the controls were hard-coded. But if you decided to play this game again, you could use DOSBox and change the rebindings there, as DOSBox has those sort of options built into it. Even though the game is in full 3D, you don't really see much of that in play. There really isn't much height to the game. In most of the levels it's just simple corridors, with very little sort of going on above you. It's not until later where you get some of the flying levels that you actually get some height. You have to travel up and down between floors, as when you're on foot, all you've got to do is get in an elevator to go up and down. You never really climb, which seems so anti-flashback, as most of that game was climbing and jumping around. Your movements have been much more restricted in this game, and I feel it's mostly because we moved to 3D, and they weren't really quite there yet with how they handled it. And because of the limitations of the 3D engine, the game does not look anywhere near as impressive as Flashback. We don't get any of those wonderful jungle levels or those wide open spaces in the cities. It's mostly just corridor after slightly bigger room after corridor. They do try and mix it up with some cool texture work and some props inside the rooms, but it's very difficult to get away from that corridor level design. Now they do mix it up, like I said, with some of the flying levels. Those levels, while more open, are definitely not the most interesting ones in the game. But one thing that is very much classic Flashback is the death sequences. They have returned in all their glory, or should I say gory, with all sorts of death types. So varied and quite cool. If you want to play this game today, there are a few options. The first one has to be DOSBox, as mentioned previously. It allows you to rebind the keys and you get to play the game as it was back then, but with more powerful hardware, so you can remove that frame limiter and see the game really stretch its legs. There is also a PS1 release. Now amazingly, this actually came out a good 2 or 3 years after the initial release and after Tomb Raider, but they really didn't use that time to improve the game all that much. We now have texture mapping on the models, but we now also have the horrible PlayStation wobbly textures and walls that we saw in far too many of its games, and they really didn't do much to improve the controls of the camera. The final way to play this game these days is actually through an engine remake called F2v Gl, or Fade to Black GL, which has tried to recreate the game using OpenGL. There is a number of releases across a few different platforms, and if you find the Windows release, you might find that it doesn't run too well because it's expecting a whole bunch of DLLs, but I'll hopefully include a link to a GitHub clone that I've done with those DLLs and recompiled to make it run a bit easier on Windows hardware. As usual, links will be in the description. Unfortunately, this was really the only proper sequel that Flashback got. There was another one on the GBA that never got finished, but there are ROMs floating around. There was a truly terrible remake that came out during the 360 and PS3 era that should be avoided like the plague, and thankfully just recently, to mark its 25th anniversary, we've had the Switch re-release. That's actually probably one of the nicer ways to play Flashback, but we've not seen anything similar come out for Fade to Black, and it'd be interesting to see them retake this game and try and touch it up and make it more playable. I feel it's one that we probably should go back to, and that there was some cool ideas and some puzzles that I really would like to see done again, but with a more controlling character. I think Flashback and Conrad deserve a comeback. And hopefully, if Flashback on the Switch does really well, we might see more of the whole series. Now, it might seem that I've been awfully down on this game, and to be honest, I have been. The controls really do hold the game back in far more ways than you can imagine. At its core, there is a good game here. It's just way ahead of its time. It had some interesting puzzles, it had some cool set pieces, and it really did push graphics and 3D technology forward. And if you manage to find a copy of the game, give it a go, either through DOSBox or through the engine remake, or even try the PS1 version. It's not the one that I really played, but it's probably one of the easier ones to get going again. And so until next time, I've been the Goldfish, and this has been Goldfish on Games.